When we think of the American Revolution, we tend to imagine a nation rising as one, fists in the air, muskets on shoulders, shouting, "Freedom," into the face of tyranny. There are fireworks, fife and drum, and perhaps a heroic George Washington crossing a river with perfect hair. But reality, as usual, is a bit messier. Not everyone was storming redcoats or reciting the Declaration of Independence by candlelight. In fact, a surprising number of people were, well, not that excited. Some were confused. Some were skeptical. And many were just trying to get through the day without getting conscripted, taxed, or evicted. In this episode of Whisper Sleep Histories, we gently pull back the patriotic curtain and drift through the quieter, more complicated side of the revolution. The side with fence-sitters, reluctant farmers, worried merchants, and people who simply had laundry to finish. So get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let's begin the story of a revolution that wasn't quite as unanimous as the textbook suggests. When we think of revolutions, we tend to imagine a certain kind of energy. The kind with raised fists, shouting crowds, angry declarations scrawled in candlelit rooms, and the rumble of change growing louder with every echoing footstep down the cobbled streets of history. In the case of the American Revolution, popular memory has worked quite hard to preserve this version, a people united, fed up, bursting forth with purpose and idealism, carrying torches of liberty and waving hastily sewn flags in defiance of their British overlords. There are drums. There are powdered wigs. There's always someone yelling, "Freedom," as though they've just invented the word. And somewhere, of course, there's George Washington standing dramatically at the front of a boat. But history, real history, rarely unfolds with such cinematic clarity. And the truth, as it tends to be, is far more quiet. A little less exciting. And in many cases, rather awkward. Not everyone was waving a flag. Not everyone even had a flag. Some people didn't know what was going on, others didn't care, and a great many weren't exactly sure which side, if any, they were supposed to be on. There were no YouTube channels to explain the revolution in 7 easy steps. No trending hashtags. No dramatic speeches going viral. Just word-of-mouth rumors, inconsistent pamphlets, and an overwhelming sense that something was happening, but not everyone was sure what, or why, or whether they were supposed to be in favor of it. In fact, for many, the American Revolution was not so much a rousing call to action as it was a persistent background noise, annoying at times, frightening at others, but always somewhat detached from the quiet routines of daily life. You see, revolutions may sound grand, but they are lived in very ordinary moments. They are carried out not only by leaders with slogans and armies with muskets, but also by innkeepers just trying to keep their doors open, by farmers worried about whether their crops will survive the next frost, by tailors wondering whether the customer who just ordered a red coat was about to be considered a traitor or a patriot, depending on what town he wore it in. For all the talk of unity and purpose, the reality is that colonial America in the 1770s was a rather fragmented place, filled with conflicting loyalties, simmering tensions, and a whole lot of people sitting squarely on the fence. Figuratively, of course. Though some may have done it literally too, depending on the condition of their porches. It's important, especially for those of us trying to understand the past without nodding off entirely, to remember that not every historical moment was experienced as monumental. Often, they felt confusing, unclear, and rather mundane. The American Revolution, for all its later glory, was not immediately viewed as a clear path to nationhood by everyone involved. In fact, for many people at the time, it was seen more like a regional spat that had gotten increasingly loud and increasingly inconvenient. Consider the average person living in one of the 13 colonies in, say, 1774. They might have been a cobbler, a smallholder, or a young woman helping to run a tavern. Their days were consumed not with lofty political theory, but with finding food, making soap, tending animals, and dodging taxes, or worse, dodging the neighbors who gossiped about taxes. News arrived slowly, sometimes distorted, and often filtered through local bias. A speech by Patrick Henry in Virginia might never reach a farmer in rural New Hampshire. A riot in Boston might be seen as distant troublemaking by those in the Carolinas. The idea of America as a single thing, let alone a unified identity, was not only new, but deeply fragile. Most people thought of themselves by colony first. Virginian, New Yorker, Georgian. The notion of being American was, for many, still rather abstract. And understandably so. It's hard to form national identity when there's no national infrastructure to carry it. And then there were the taxes. Ah yes, the taxes. Much is made of the phrase, no taxation without representation, a rallying cry immortalized in textbooks and reenactments. But for many colonists, the issue wasn't so much representation as it was, well, taxation. Period. Most people weren't writing letters to Parliament demanding democratic reform. They were just irritated that tea cost more this week, or that a familiar good now had a stamp on it, or that the local smugglers had been caught and now everything was harder to get. Revolutionary fervor, as it turns out, doesn't always stem from high-minded ideals, it often comes from practical frustrations. And those frustrations don't always result in immediate loyalty to any one side. They can, just as often, lead to general grumbling and strategic inaction. Waiting to see who wins. Hoping not to get noticed. Indeed, one of the most overlooked facts about the American Revolution is how many people wanted nothing to do with it. They weren't loyalists. They weren't revolutionaries. They were ambivalent. Apathetic. Or just plain tired. Tired of political games, tired of disruptions, tired of being told that everything was changing when all they really wanted was a predictable harvest and maybe a few quiet Sundays. And of course, there were those who did pick sides. But even then, the reasons were rarely straightforward. A merchant might favor the British because of trade ties. A farmer might support the revolution because British soldiers had trampled his fields. A young man might join the Continental Army not because he believed in liberty, but because they offered a signing bonus. Motivations were messy, personal, and contradictory. And many who signed up for one cause would later desert it, literally or figuratively, when conditions changed. This is not to say the revolution lacked passion or courage. There were moments of real conviction, real risk, and real change. But these moments did not define everyone's experience. And they did not make the chaos any less confusing for those caught in the middle. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we believe there's something worth exploring in the margins of these grand events, in the quiet spaces between battle cries and declarations. In the hesitant footsteps of people who weren't quite sure where history was heading. Or whether they even wanted to follow it. That's where this story begins. Not with a bang, but with a long, collective pause. Because revolutions, for all their rhetoric, often arrive to the sound of silence. And it is in that silence that we find the other side of the story. So tonight, as you settle in, we'll begin our journey through the quieter corners of the American Revolution. A story not of unanimous fervor, but of cautious curiosity, practical concerns, and the many, many people who watched the world shift, from a rather safe distance. Close your eyes if you like. We'll still be here. Whispering you through the parts of history that most people forget were even there. There is a popular illusion, stitched lovingly into the fabric of American myth, that the colonists were united. That at the first whiff of tyranny from across the Atlantic, 13 rugged little proto-states locked arms and together declared, with thunderous resolve, not today, King George. The reality, of course, was considerably more disjointed. Like most large families forced into a group decision, the colonies did not function as one harmonious body, but rather as a collection of competing interests, mistrustful neighbors, and low-grade passive aggression held together by a mixture of necessity and reluctant compromise. To begin with, these colonies weren't exactly designed to be friends. They had been founded at different times, by different groups, for different reasons. Massachusetts was built on Puritan zeal, Virginia on tobacco dreams, Georgia on something about debtors and second chances that even Georgia didn't seem entirely clear on. Their economies varied. Their religious cultures ranged from buttoned-up Congregationalism to more freewheeling Anglicanism to the occasional Quaker trying to stay out of everyone's way. And while they all spoke some form of English, they often didn't speak it to each other. Not kindly, at least. Trade disputes simmered. Border disagreements festered. New Yorkers thought everyone else was slow. Rhode Islanders were largely ignored. And South Carolinians operated as if they were their own kingdom, which in spirit, they often were. So when tension with Britain began to rise, the idea that these disparate societies would suddenly act as one was optimistic, if not delusional. Some colonies were eager for change. Boston, for instance, had developed a taste for resistance. Whether through protest, pamphlet, or the occasional tea party conducted on someone else's ship, Massachusetts had a knack for spectacle. But other colonies were far less interested in poking the imperial bear. Pennsylvania, for instance, was full of Quakers and German immigrants who preferred peace and bread-making to politics and muskets. The South, reliant on British trade and wary of Northern radicals, was hesitant. Even in Virginia, home to a number of fiery orators, enthusiasm for full-blown revolution took time to catch on. And once it did, it came with its own carefully hedged concerns, mostly about property, order, and how to maintain control once the British were gone. The colonies were also not equally affected by British policies. What angered one region often barely registered in another. Take the infamous Stamp Act, for example. It caused outrage in cities where newspapers, legal documents, and printed materials were essential. But in the rural backcountry, where many people still signed with an X and couldn't afford a newspaper even if it weren't taxed, it seemed more like a distant fuss made by people in wigs. And while elites were writing treatises about natural rights and representative government, the common folk were often more preoccupied with immediate needs, whether the price of salt had gone up again, whether the local militia had requisitioned too many pigs, or whether the nearby tavern would still serve ale despite rumors of civil unrest. Revolutionary ideals filtered downward slowly, if at all. And when they did, they often arrived reworded, misquoted, and accompanied by contradictory instructions. Then there was the matter of power. Revolutionary leaders may have spoken of equality and the consent of the governed, but they were also deeply concerned about who, exactly, would be doing the governing. A revolution meant change. And change meant the possibility of someone else being in charge. For the upper classes, those who owned land, businesses, or political offices, this was both exciting and terrifying. They wanted to be free of Britain, yes. But they also wanted to remain in control. And that meant keeping the lower classes from getting any wild ideas about, say, redistributing wealth, land, or influence. One of the less celebrated truths of the American Revolution is that many of its leaders were not fighting to upend hierarchy, but to preserve it in more familiar, local terms. They believed in liberty, but preferably for men who looked and acted like themselves. They believed in justice, but not necessarily for tenants, servants, or anyone unable to quote Locke. And while they were happy to denounce British taxes, they were often the same people who imposed local taxes on their own neighbors. Independence, for them, was not a dismantling of the system. It was an opportunity to sit at the top of it. This dissonance created friction not only between colonies, but within them. In many towns and villages, there were sharp divides between those who supported the revolutionary cause and those who didn't. Families were split. Friends became suspicious. Neighbors stopped speaking. And local assemblies became battlegrounds, not of musket fire, but of shouted accusations, smears, and uncomfortable silence. In some areas, committees of safety were formed to monitor loyalty, enforce boycotts, and ensure compliance with revolutionary aims. These committees were a mix of civic duty and veiled intimidation, depending on where you stood politically. For some, they were a step toward grassroots democracy. For others, they were a sign that the mob had taken over. People accused of Loyalist sympathies could be shunned, harassed, or even physically attacked. And yet, in the same town, someone else might be chastised for being too radical, too rash, too willing to throw everything away for the dream of self-governance. The result was a landscape of uncertainty. No one could be quite sure who was on whose side, or whether today's revolutionary would be tomorrow's tyrant. Allegiances shifted. People lied, exaggerated, or feigned ignorance to protect themselves. And many simply tried to stay neutral, not because they lacked convictions, but because they feared what conviction might cost them. The idea of neutrality itself became suspect. To be neutral was to risk being labeled a coward or a traitor. But neutrality, for many, was the only sane option. It allowed one to keep doing business. To keep farming. To keep a roof over one's head. It was, in many ways, the revolution's most common and most reasonable position. But it was also the most invisible. History remembers the patriots and the loyalists. It does not often remember the ones who quietly hoped the whole thing would just end. And then, of course, there were those who changed sides. Not out of duplicity, but out of evolving understanding, or shifting circumstances. A man might begin the decade loyal to Britain, only to find himself swept into the revolutionary current after a neighbor was unjustly punished. Or he might support the revolution early, only to regret it when his farm was burned by rebels enforcing a tax he never voted for. These shifts were not rare. They were part of the texture of the time, a reflection of how fluid, how emotional, and how personal the political became. In this swirling confusion, one begins to see why the colonies were not one happy family. They were, instead, 13 ornery siblings with different ambitions, different parents, and different grudges. Thrown together by geography, forced into cooperation by crisis, and constantly bickering about who was cleaning up after whom. Their alliance was forged not in unity, but in mutual frustration. And when the revolution came, it was not met with a chorus of agreement, but with a series of hesitant nods, silent calculations, and whispered doubts. It is tempting, in retrospect, to view the founding of America as the product of shared purpose. But that would be a bit like saying a potluck dinner proves everyone enjoys the same food. In truth, some brought dishes out of obligation. Others came to avoid being judged. A few forgot and just showed up for dessert. The miracle is not that everyone agreed, it's that they agreed enough, long enough, to get something started. And what they started would, in time, become a nation. But in 1775, it was still a collection of regions, interests, and personalities trying to figure out whether they were better off together or apart. The debates were loud. The stakes were high. And the certainty, for most, was in short supply. So as we continue our journey through the revolution that wasn't quite as enthusiastic as it now appears, remember, beneath the slogans and speeches, there were real people. And those people were complicated. They were unsure. They were not all on the same page. In fact, many of them weren't even reading the same book. And yet, somehow, they moved forward. Not as one happy family, but as a reluctant gathering of strangers with overlapping complaints and just enough momentum to keep going. What came next was not destiny. It was improvised. And it was, above all, deeply human. Now breathe, slowly, and let the chaos of colonial bickering lull you into that gentle stillness between then and now. There's more to come, and none of it will be simple. When telling stories of revolutions, it's convenient, almost comforting, to divide people into two neat camps. On one side, the brave, freedom-loving patriots, nobly resisting the heavy hand of empire. On the other, the villains, sycophants, and bootlickers, clinging desperately to the old ways, unwilling to rise to the occasion of liberty. It's tidy, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying. But as with most things involving real people, real fear, and real uncertainty, the truth is considerably less clear-cut. Enter the Loyalists. Or, as they're often portrayed in popular imagination, the people who just didn't get the memo that tyranny was supposed to be bad. But let's pause for a moment, slowly, gently, and breathe in the more complicated reality. The Loyalists were not cartoon villains twirling red-coated mustaches. They were farmers, merchants, lawyers, clergy, and ordinary families. Some were wealthy. Others barely made ends meet. Some lived in cities, some in the wilderness, and many quietly tried to hold their lives together as the world they knew began to fray at the seams. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the colonial population remained loyal to the British Crown throughout the war. That's not a trivial minority. It's hundreds of thousands of people. People who, for one reason or another, didn't find the revolutionary cause all that compelling, or all that wise. Some loyalists were genuinely committed to Britain. They saw themselves as British subjects, tied to a long history, a legal system, and a monarch they respected, or at the very least tolerated. To them, the king wasn't a tyrant, he was a distant but legitimate ruler, and the idea of violently overthrowing him felt not only wrong but dangerous. The very concept of rebellion, to many loyalists, conjured images of chaos, mob rule, and the breakdown of everything that kept society more or less functioning. Others were loyal for more practical reasons. Trade, for instance. Britain was the colony's largest trading partner, and many merchants, shipbuilders, and craftsmen depended on the imperial economy to keep their businesses afloat. Aligning with revolutionaries meant risking economic ruin. Some had debts owed by British firms. Some had contracts that would be invalidated by war. And some simply preferred stability over whatever experiment the revolutionaries were proposing. Then there were political and religious considerations. Anglican ministers, whose allegiance to the Church of England was both spiritual and institutional, often found themselves on the Loyalist side, partly because their salaries were paid in pounds and partly because treason didn't look great on a Sunday sermon. In regions with significant Loyalist sentiment, such as New York, parts of the South, and certain pockets of Pennsylvania, the pull of tradition was strong, and the risk of open rebellion felt personal. But beyond ideology, beyond economics or ecclesiastical salary structures, there was something else: fear. Real, human, bone-deep fear. The fear of losing your home. The fear of waking up one morning to find your barn burned because your neighbors suspected you of sympathizing with the wrong side. The fear that, if the rebels lost, and it certainly seemed possible, they'd take you down with them. And perhaps most of all, the fear that if the rebels won, they wouldn't stop at liberty. That their vision of freedom would leave some people, like you, outside its circle. Because the revolution, for all its high-minded language, wasn't just about breaking away from Britain. It was about redefining power. And when power shifts, people get nervous. The Loyalists weren't cowards, they were cautious. And caution, in the middle of a war for the future of a continent, isn't such a laughable instinct. Some were burned by previous attempts at change. Others looked at the rhetoric of the revolutionaries and saw more opportunism than idealism. They noticed that many of those shouting about liberty also happened to be landowners, slaveholders, or elites with vested interests. They saw committees that resembled inquisitions, punishments meted out without trials, and the rise of local militias that answered to no one. To them, it didn't look like freedom, it looked like power changing hands, but not necessarily for the better. And it's worth noting that Loyalist wasn't a uniform identity. Some people actively supported British rule and even fought in Loyalist regiments. Others were passive sympathizers who tried to stay out of trouble. Many were somewhere in between, conflicted, uncertain, torn between loyalty to the crown and affection for their colonial communities. It was not uncommon for someone to switch sides, or to try to support both sides at different times, depending on which army was marching through town that week. This ambiguity made Loyalists particularly vulnerable. They were not simply opponents in a distant debate, they were neighbors, friends, and sometimes family members. And revolutions, by their nature, are not fond of ambiguity. They thrive on clarity, slogans, and the moral high ground. So Loyalists, even those who posed no threat, became targets of suspicion and, in many cases, retaliation. Property was seized. Names were published. People were tarred and feathered, a grotesque form of humiliation and torture. Some were imprisoned. Some were run out of town. And some, fearing for their lives, fled entirely, heading to Canada, to the Caribbean, or back to Britain, where they found themselves not welcomed as heroes, but regarded with mild confusion and often bureaucratic neglect. The suffering of Loyalists rarely makes its way into revolutionary folklore. Their stories are inconvenient. They remind us that the line between patriotism and persecution is thin, especially when the people being persecuted aren't obviously villainous. It is easier to remember rebels than refugees, easier to celebrate victory than to examine who paid the price for it. But the Loyalists did pay. Some lost everything. Others tried to rebuild. Many lived the rest of their lives in exile, wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. And what of the post-war years? When the revolution was over and the new nation began its slow, stumbling walk toward governance, what happened to the Loyalists who remained? In some cases, they reintegrated. In others, they were shunned. The new republic, eager to move forward, had little appetite for reconciling with those who had doubted its birth. Pardon proclamations were issued, but healing was uneven. Communities remained divided. Old resentments lingered like smoke long after the fire had gone out. It is one of the quiet ironies of the American Revolution that the side preaching liberty and tolerance could be so intolerant of dissent. But such is the nature of revolutions, they are not calm. They are not kind. And they often make little room for those who hesitate. Still, the Loyalists remind us that history is not simply made by victors and villains. It is made by doubters, dissenters, and those who walk away from the noise, unsure of where they belong. Their caution, their reservations, and their refusal to follow the crowd deserve not scorn, but understanding. Because behind every act of loyalty was not just submission, but a calculation, a belief, or a quiet fear that perhaps, just perhaps, this revolution might not end the way its authors hoped. So as we lie here, listening to the past rustle softly through memory, let us pause and consider those who were loyal, not out of weakness, but out of conviction. Not out of ignorance, but out of experience. And not because they feared liberty, but because they questioned whether liberty would truly belong to them. History has a habit of moving forward with great momentum, sweeping away those who stand in its path. But if we slow down, if we listen carefully, we might still hear the quieter voices, the ones who said no, or not yet, or I'm not sure. And in those voices, we might find something closer to truth than any triumphant slogan could ever offer. In most retellings of the American Revolution, the story is focused tightly on two sides, the British, with their red coats, powdered wigs, and distant king, and the American colonists, with their homespun clothing, righteous fury, and a dream of self-governance. These are the actors most often placed center stage, speaking in impassioned tones about freedom, taxes, and destiny. But behind them, sometimes beside them, sometimes between them, and often beneath their notice, were the peoples who had been living on the land long before America was even an idea. They were not British. They were not American. They were native. And no one really asked them what they thought. In the decades leading up to the revolution, native nations had already weathered wave after wave of European incursion. Diseases had ravaged populations. Treaties had been signed and broken, again and again. Missionaries came with good intentions, settlers with plows and rifles, traders with shiny goods and shifting loyalties. Land that had once seemed vast and endless had been swallowed by parcels, fences, and maps with lines drawn in languages they didn't speak. By the mid-18th century, native peoples across the continent were no strangers to colonial politics. They had learned, sometimes painfully, that European conflicts spilled across the Atlantic like oil on water, coating everything in their wake. They had fought in wars not of their own making, the French and Indian War being the most recent and most devastating example, and they had seen promises from white governments dissolve like mist. So when the colonies began rattling their sabers and muttering about liberty, many native groups watched with weary eyes. Some wondered whether it mattered who won. Others feared it mattered too much. It's important to pause here and remember that Native Americans were not a single group, but a multitude of distinct nations, each with its own language, leadership, and relationship to colonial powers. Some had long-standing trade partnerships with the British. Others had forged uneasy coexistence with French settlers. Some, like the Iroquois Confederacy, had managed to maintain a powerful, semi-independent stance by carefully navigating between European rivals. Their choices during the Revolution would not be made as a bloc, but as individual nations responding to particular pressures. And yet, as the colonies slipped further into rebellion, it became clear that the war would not spare the native lands. The British, for their part, saw strategic value in native alliances. The Proclamation Line of 1763, one of the grievances that so enraged the colonists, had been a British attempt to limit westward expansion beyond the Appalachians, in part to prevent further conflict with native nations. It was a pragmatic move, unpopular with settlers who dreamed of new land, but welcomed by many native communities as a rare act of restraint. That restraint, however, would not last. As revolution stirred, the British sought native support, hoping that alliances could slow down rebel advances, tie up colonial militias, and protect key trade routes. They offered weapons, supplies, and, most importantly, promises to respect territorial boundaries, to curb settler aggression, to recognize sovereignty. Some native leaders were skeptical, with good reason. But others, seeing the surge of anti-British sentiment among land-hungry colonists, believed they had more to lose if the revolutionaries won. Among those who sided with the Crown were groups like the Mohawk, led by the influential Joseph Brant, who became one of the most notable native figures of the war. Educated in British schools, fluent in English, and deeply loyal to the Crown, Brant believed that British victory offered the best chance for preserving Iroquois lands. It was a bitter calculation, one made with a long view. Because while British officials had often failed to protect native territories, they had at least made gestures, commissions, boundaries, orders, that acknowledged that native nations existed as political entities. The revolutionaries, by contrast, seemed primarily interested in expansion. Liberty, for them, often meant the liberty to move westward. The Continental Congress made few efforts to include native voices. While some overtures were made, occasional treaties, vague proclamations, the revolutionaries largely saw native peoples not as potential allies, but as obstacles or threats. The rhetoric of liberty did not extend in their direction. The Declaration of Independence, that sacred text of American aspiration, refers to merciless Indian savages as one of the king's tools of oppression, a line that neatly encapsulates the position many colonists held, that native resistance was less a political stance than a barbaric nuisance. And so, throughout the war, native communities were caught in an impossible bind. Support the British, and risk punishment if the rebels won. Stay neutral, and risk being targeted by both sides. Support the revolutionaries, and watch them march through your land when the war was over. It was a no-win situation. The result was a series of civil wars within native nations, as different factions aligned with different sides, tearing apart old alliances and family bonds. The Iroquois Confederacy, once a powerful league, fractured under the strain. The Oneida chose to support the Americans, the Seneca sided with the British. Battles that had nothing to do with native goals became battles fought on native soil, with native blood. And when the war ended, those who had chosen the British side were left to face the consequences. For native allies of the Crown, the defeat of Britain was not just a military loss, it was a devastating betrayal. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war in 1783, was negotiated without native representation. It transferred vast territories, lands still inhabited, still sacred, still fought for, directly from Britain to the United States, as if the people living there were invisible. Their sovereignty was not considered. Their loyalties, sacrifices, or pleas did not merit a footnote. For native nations who had supported the revolutionaries, the outcome was no better. Gratitude was thin. Treaties were temporary. Settlers moved in with increasing speed, claiming the lands they believed had been bought with blood. The new government, eager to assert control and eager for land to pay its war debts, began pressing westward. Resistance was met with violence. Negotiations were often backed by force. The cycle began again. And in this quiet turning of the historical page, native voices faded from the main narrative. Not because they weren't speaking, but because the new American myth had no place for them. The revolution was cast as a story of freedom. And freedom, it seemed, did not apply to those whose ancestors had lived here the longest. Even in memory, they were pushed aside. Their choices oversimplified. Their motives misrepresented. Bravery turned into villainy. Wisdom turned into folklore. And the nuanced, painful reality of their role in the revolution became just another shadow in a story that preferred clear heroes and clear villains. But if we listen, really listen, we can still hear the complexity. The councils held in longhouses and forest clearings. The debates among elders about whether to trust another promise. The sorrow of watching kinsmen fight each other in a white man's war. The quiet hope, and then the quiet despair, as the new American government claimed the land it had once said it was fighting to protect. So much of history is told through the eyes of the powerful. But here, in the soft silence between battles and treaties, lies another truth. That even in revolution, even in rebellion against empire, there are those who are not given a choice. Who are forced to navigate between two storms, never sure which one will leave them standing. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we try not to forget those voices. We slow down, we breathe in the parts of history that don't fit easily on commemorative coins or patriotic placards. And in doing so, we remember that freedom, like land, was something fought over again and again. But it was not always shared. Let that thought linger with you as you rest. Not to trouble your sleep, but to soften your understanding. Because behind every war is a quieter war. And behind every revolution, there are those who were never invited to the table. The wind on the plains still carries their memory. The rivers still know their names. And if we listen long enough, perhaps we will too. It is a peculiar thing, how revolutions can be so full of talk about freedom, and yet leave so many in chains. The American Revolution is remembered as a battle cry for liberty, a heroic stand against tyranny, and a triumphant birth of a nation. But beneath the soaring rhetoric of unalienable rights and the thunderous applause for declarations penned with elegant conviction, there remained, quite visibly, quite horrifically, millions of people for whom none of it applied. They did not fight for the right to self-govern, because they were not allowed to govern themselves. They did not write pamphlets, because they were not taught to read. They did not declare independence, because their bodies were already declared the legal property of others. These were the enslaved. And no one really asked them what they thought either. By the time the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, slavery had long been entrenched in the American colonies. It was not incidental or peripheral, it was foundational. In the southern colonies, the economy depended on it. On the plantations of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, tobacco and rice were grown not by entrepreneurial colonists with free hands and dreams of liberty, but by men, women, and children who had no freedom at all. In the North, slavery existed too, less visibly, perhaps, but no less real. Slaves cooked meals, cleaned homes, built cities, hauled cargo, and generated wealth in places that now pride themselves on revolutionary spirit. So when the colonists began their rebellion, claiming that they were being treated as slaves by a distant king, it rang strange in the ears of those who were actually enslaved. It was, to put it mildly, a painful metaphor. A poetic exaggeration that conveniently ignored the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings owned like livestock, bought and sold like furniture, abused with impunity, and denied even the most basic recognition of personhood. The contradiction was glaring. And yet, for many of the revolution's leaders, it barely registered as a contradiction at all. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, did so while owning over 600 enslaved people in his lifetime. George Washington commanded the Continental Army while worrying about runaways from Mount Vernon. Patrick Henry, he of "Give me liberty or give me death," also gave orders to enslaved laborers and worried about the practicalities of emancipation. Liberty, it seemed, had its boundaries. But not everyone was blind to the hypocrisy. Many enslaved people heard the talk of freedom, and they listened carefully. They heard about the rights of man and the tyranny of kings, and they recognized, perhaps more clearly than anyone, the bitter irony. They knew what bondage was. And they were not content to stay quiet while others shouted for independence. Some took action. With war spreading across the colonies, opportunities arose, small, dangerous, fleeting opportunities, to escape. The chaos of revolution opened cracks in the system. Armies moved, patrols were stretched thin, masters were distracted. And into those cracks, some enslaved people stepped, running towards something uncertain but free of chains. And then there were the promises. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the British Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person who escaped from rebel masters and joined the British forces. It was a shrewd military tactic, aimed at weakening the rebellion by encouraging desertions. But for the enslaved, it sounded like hope. Thousands responded. They fled plantations, navigated forests, braved militias, and arrived, panting, hungry, terrified, at British lines. Many were put to work in support roles, building fortifications, carrying supplies, cooking, digging. Some were armed. Some fought. And some died. Disease swept through crowded camps. British generals, unsure what to do with the influx, often offered little protection. In some cases, when the military situation turned bleak, they abandoned their black allies or returned them to their former owners. Not all promises of freedom were kept. And yet, some were. At the end of the war, thousands of formerly enslaved people who had served the British were evacuated to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or even Britain itself. Their names were recorded in the Book of Negroes, a rare and precious document that tells the story of those who dared to believe in a better life, even when it was offered by a flawed and fading empire. Not everyone went north. Some stayed and faced re-enslavement. Others were betrayed by neighbors. Some were caught, punished, sold, erased. And what of the revolutionaries? Did they offer anything to the enslaved? Occasionally. Sporadically. Unevenly. In the North, gradual emancipation laws began to appear, often framed more as a concession to revolutionary ideals than as acts of true justice. In states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, enslaved people petitioned for freedom, citing the same principles their white neighbors were using to sever ties with Britain. Sometimes they won. More often they waited. In the South, things moved slower. The institution of slavery was too deeply embedded, too economically central. There were whispers of gradual change, but they were drowned out by the rustle of profit. And though some individual slaveholders freed people in their wills, many more clung tightly to ownership, even as they cheered the fall of a monarchy they claimed was too controlling. And so, for most of the enslaved, the revolution passed them by. They were not citizens. They were not soldiers. They were not asked to vote, or to write constitutions, or to shape the new republic. But they were always watching. Listening. Waiting. Some recorded their thoughts later. In letters, in testimonies, in the rare biographies of those who lived to see freedom. Their reflections reveal a deep understanding of the revolution's double-edged nature. It was, to them, a moment of both betrayal and opportunity. A moment when the loudest voices claimed liberty, while the quietest ones still suffered in silence. But they endured. And in enduring, they planted seeds. The language of freedom, once spoken aloud, could not be unsaid. The declarations written by enslavers could be turned back on them. The revolution, even if it had not included them, had created a vocabulary that could one day be used to demand a fuller, truer liberation. It would take generations. It would take war, another one. And even then, it would not be enough. But the revolution left behind a paradox, a country founded on liberty that still permitted bondage. A country that claimed universal rights while denying them in practice. And a people who, despite it all, still dreamed of something better. As we rest here, drifting through the quiet shadows of history, let us remember that revolutions are rarely complete. They are not finished in one generation. They do not always honor their slogans. And they do not always begin where we think they do. Sometimes, the truest revolutions happen in secret. In whispers. In prayers. In stolen moments of hope. In the act of surviving a world that refuses to see you as fully human, and yet insisting, again and again, that you are. These were the people the revolution left behind. But they never left the revolution behind. And in time, they would rise, not with fanfare, but with patient strength. So breathe slowly, and let their story settle in your chest like embers. Because this, too, is part of the history we rarely tell, the history beneath the fireworks. The silence beneath the speeches. The people who were not freed by the revolution, but who carried its unfinished promise forward, quietly and relentlessly, into the future. In the grand theaters of revolution, the spotlight rarely lingers on those who cooked the meals. Or washed the blood from the linens. Or stood quietly in doorways, listening to arguments that would shape nations but would never invite them to speak. And yet, through all the speeches, through all the musket fire, through all the oaths sworn in candlelight, women were there. Always there. Often just out of frame. And usually, almost stubbornly, left out of the final cut. The American Revolution, like most major historical upheavals, was publicly performed by men. It was a stage filled with generals, delegates, and orators, each one dressed in waistcoats and conviction, declaring new orders and new freedoms with a flourish. But behind the fluttering flags and the grand declarations stood women, uninvited to the table, and yet expected to keep it set. They were, quite literally, the ones holding things together. At the start of the war, most women in the colonies had no political voice. They could not vote. They could not hold public office. Their legal identities were often absorbed into their husbands. Their duties were practical, their roles domestic. The revolution, with all its lofty language, offered them little in the way of change, at least on paper. And yet, it arrived in their lives all the same. As men left to fight or organize or agitate, women were left with the farms, the shops, the households. They managed budgets, raised children, harvested crops, and kept communities from collapsing under the weight of absence. They were not merely keeping busy. They were surviving. Adapting. Improvising. Because when war comes, it does not pause to ask whether your skills include mending fences, slaughtering livestock, or negotiating with creditors. It simply leaves you with fewer hands and more to carry. In some cases, women took over family businesses. In others, they formed ad hoc networks to share supplies, information, and labor. When shortages struck, they organized. When inflation raged, they rioted, quietly, and with polite determination. There were protests over bread. Over tea. Over cloth. Not flamboyant rebellions, but urgent actions rooted in the necessities of daily life. There were also spies. Messengers. Couriers. Women carried information between camps and homes, hid letters in hems and bonnets, passed maps tucked into loaves of bread. Sometimes they did it out of loyalty to the cause. Sometimes for pay. And sometimes simply because someone had to do it, and they happened to be available. Still others followed the armies, not as soldiers, but as camp followers. This term, which sounds quaint to modern ears, described women who cooked, laundered, mended, and tended to the injured. Some were wives or mothers. Some were widows or displaced. Many were paid little or nothing. They trudged behind marching columns, slept on damp ground, and risked the same diseases that decimated troops. Their presence was tolerated, sometimes resented, occasionally praised. But always essential. And some, of course, were caught in the crossfire, literally and figuratively. War, even a revolution for liberty, does not spare civilians. Homes were looted. Towns were burned. Families were torn apart. Husbands vanished. Sons were conscripted. Letters stopped arriving. Food grew scarce. And through it all, women remained at the center of an unraveling normalcy, doing what they could to hold it together with string and willpower. Some, like Deborah Sampson, disguised themselves as men and fought in the army. Her story, often romanticized, was one of risk and reinvention, a brief flicker of recognition in a sea of anonymity. Others, like Margaret Corbin, took up arms after their husbands fell, loading cannons and defending fortifications, only to be forgotten when the bullets stopped. But for most, the revolution was something that happened to them, not for them. Abigail Adams, in her famous letters to her husband John, pleaded for women to be remembered in the new code of laws. "Remember the ladies," she wrote, with a touch of humor masking a deeper truth. She warned that if they were not given voice, they might rebel. But the reply was dismissive, a joke, a reassurance that men would remain in charge. And they did. The new republic was built without them. The Constitution did not mention them. The rights so loudly claimed were for men, a word used with deliberate specificity. Liberty, once again, had limits. Even so, the experience of the revolution left its mark. Women who had managed farms, led households, traded goods, and organized protests did not simply return to quiet corners. Some did, by necessity. But the memory of action lingered. It stirred new conversations. Planted seeds. It reminded some that they had acted bravely and competently, even when the law denied their full humanity. And in the decades that followed, those memories would begin to stir louder questions, about suffrage, about education, about equality. Not all at once. And not everywhere. But the silence began to shift. Yet during the revolution itself, women remained largely unseen. And when seen, they were often misunderstood. They were called patriotic when they sewed flags, but disruptive when they marched for food. They were praised for virtue, but mocked for ambition. Their loyalty was assumed, but their opinions unwelcome. They were expected to raise citizens, but not be citizens. Expected to sacrifice, but not ask for more. And yet, through all of this, they endured. They persisted. Not always by choice, but often with quiet grace. They told bedtime stories that wrapped political truths in safe language. They taught children to read from books filled with ideals they themselves were denied. They wrote letters full of coded pain, praying for husbands to return and food to last. They nursed soldiers who never learned their names. They mourned in silence, because grief was supposed to be private. And when the war was over, they baked bread for the same men who would go on to vote without them. History is not cruel. It is merely inattentive. And in its inattentiveness, it overlooks those whose work is not shouted. Women in the American Revolution were not always revolutionaries by design. But they lived through it. Carried it. And bore its weight. So tonight, as the past settles around you like a warm, worn quilt, let us take a moment to sit in the kitchens, the fields, the makeshift hospitals, and the candlelit bedrooms where the other side of revolution was lived. Let us listen to the voices that whispered through letters, hummed lullabies to anxious children, and asked no reward beyond survival. This is their revolution, not told in battles, but in endurance. Not in speeches, but in care. Not in victory, but in presence. Because not all revolutions are won on the battlefield. Some are won in the quiet refusal to disappear. And here, beneath the sound of history's louder names, their story hums on. There's a temptation, when looking back on wars, to focus on the battles. On the booming cannons, the galloping horses, the sudden charges across open fields. The moments where history feels loud. But the truth of war, for most of the people who endure it, is not found in noise. It's found in waiting. And more waiting. And then, when that's done, a little more waiting. The American Revolution, like most wars, is remembered for its climactic moments, the midnight ride, the crossing of the Delaware, the surrender at Yorktown. But in between these dramatic peaks stretched long, flat valleys of boredom, hunger, confusion, and discomfort. And for the ordinary soldier, those valleys were the real war. To enlist in the Continental Army was not, in most cases, a stirring act of patriotism. It was, for many, a practical decision, or a desperate one. Young men signed up for enlistment bounties, for promised land grants, or because they'd been out of work for months and had few other options. Some were drafted. Some were pressured. Some simply followed friends. The slogans about liberty and tyranny were embroidered on flags, but not necessarily on the hearts of the people holding the muskets. Once enlisted, the reality of military life set in. Which is to say, it didn't feel much like life. Tents were crowded. Supplies were scarce. Food was inconsistent at best, spoiled at worst. Uniforms were often non-existent, some men wore their own clothes until they fell apart, and even then, nothing much was provided to replace them. Shoes were a luxury. Blankets, coveted. Soap, mythical. Disease was a constant companion. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. The enemy did not always wear red. Sometimes it came in the form of bad water, unwashed hands, and the coughing of a fellow soldier 2 feet away. Winter, especially, was brutal. The cold seeped into bones and refused to leave. Men huddled together for warmth, wrapped in whatever scraps they could find, praying for spring, and perhaps for socks. Valley Forge, of course, has become a symbol of this suffering. The name alone conjures images of ragged soldiers standing in snow, teeth clenched against hunger and frostbite, staring out into a blank and indifferent wilderness. And while the mythology often adds a touch of noble suffering, the reality was far more grim, and far less organized. They were cold. They were starving. They were, at times, mutinous. George Washington himself worried that the army would collapse not from enemy fire, but from despair and rot. And yet, even outside of these famous episodes, the entire war was a patchwork of discomfort. Marching for days without proper boots. Eating hardtack that required soaking to be even marginally chewable. Standing in mud waiting for orders that never came. Hearing rumors of battles that had happened weeks ago, or hadn't happened at all. Mail arrived slowly, if at all. Pay arrived even slower. And more often than not, it didn't arrive at all. Congress, bold in its declarations but chronically broke, struggled to feed or fund its army. Soldiers went months without wages. Some were paid in promissory notes that wouldn't mature for years, if ever. Morale, unsurprisingly, sank. Desertion was common. Not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. Men left to check on their farms and never returned. Others disappeared into forests, into towns, into other lives. Some went home and found that no one really cared if they came back. War, for them, was not glory, it was interruption. Those who remained did so for many reasons. Some out of duty. Some out of camaraderie. Some because they had nowhere else to go. And some because the idea of quitting felt worse than staying. There were, of course, battles. But they were not as frequent as stories suggest. Many months passed with no major engagements. Skirmishes occurred, yes, but full-scale battles were rare. And when they did happen, they were often chaotic, disorganized, and inconclusive. Weapons misfired. Commands were misheard. Lines broke. Men got lost. Histories tend to straighten these events into neat arrows of progress, victory here, setback there, but on the ground, it was mostly confusion. Gunpowder smoke obscured vision. Rain turned gunpowder to mush. Bayonets slipped. Horses bolted. And the cries of the wounded blurred into the thud of boots on wet earth. Afterward, there were bodies to bury. Weapons to clean. wounds to treat with inadequate supplies. And then, more waiting. When the British pulled out of Boston, there was celebration. But also, more waiting. When the French joined the war, there was hope. But then, more waiting. When Washington surprised the enemy at Trenton, it lifted spirits. But only briefly. The war, like a stubborn winter, dragged on. For civilians, it was no better. Families waited for news. For sons to return. For letters to explain what was happening. They waited for food prices to drop. For soldiers to stop requisitioning their livestock. For tax collectors to skip their house. The war, though it called itself revolutionary, rarely felt exciting to those inside it. It felt slow. It felt uncertain. It felt like a series of postponements, a long intermission in the ordinary rhythm of life. There were no fireworks on the frontier, just the creak of wagons, the sobs of the wounded, and the quiet sighs of women boiling another pot of thin soup. When peace finally came, many soldiers returned home to find their farms in disrepair, their debts unpaid, their promised pensions still a promise. Some never returned. Others had no home to return to. The war had changed the map, changed the politics, changed the story, but it hadn't changed their daily hunger, or the ache in their feet. And still, the myth persisted. The noble Minuteman. The fearless patriot. The stoic Continental. And while some of that may be true, may even be earned, it leaves out the waiting. The cold. The boredom. The long months of wondering whether anything would ever happen, and when it did, whether it had been worth all this. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we like to sit in those moments, the in-between ones. The places where glory falters and humanity peers through. Where war is not a charge, but a chill. Where revolution is not a trumpet, but a long, slow breath. So as you drift deeper into quiet tonight, think not of the cannons, but of the creaking cots. Think of the man staring into a tin cup, wondering if it will be soup or just water again. Think of the young boy with frostbitten toes trying to remember why he left home in the first place. Think of the mail that never came, the boots that never fit, the comrades who never woke. And let it remind you that most of history is not made in shouting. It is made in waiting. Quietly. Patiently. With sore feet and empty bellies. And when you hear about great wars, remember the long silences between each gunshot. Because that, too, is part of the story. There is a particular kind of silence that settles in after the fireworks. A silence not born of peace, exactly, but of confusion. Of anticlimax. Of the unsettling realization that the drums have stopped beating, the crowds have gone home, the slogans have grown quiet, and now someone has to figure out how to pay the bill. The American Revolution, like so many revolutions before and since, ended not with a satisfying resolution, but with a question. A long, awkward, echoing question. So, now what? The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. British troops withdrew. The king conceded, somewhat begrudgingly, that these distant colonies were now a new nation. There were parades, of course. There were toasts and speeches and triumphant newspaper headlines. Liberty had been won. Tyranny, it seemed, had been thrown off. And the United States of America had been born. But as the cheers faded and the ink dried, there was one small, inconvenient detail still to be addressed. Nobody knew quite what they were doing. Winning a war is, as it turns out, not the same thing as building a country. And the people now in charge, many of them farmers, merchants, lawyers, and former rebels, looked around and realized that the thing they had fought so long to dismantle had, inconveniently, been the thing holding everything together. There was no king anymore. No parliament. No royal governors. No imperial bureaucracy. No uniform system of law. What remained was a loose collection of states, each with its own preferences, quirks, and grudges. 13 sovereign entities bound together more by shared exhaustion than by any deep consensus. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at national governance, reflected this ambiguity. It created a central government that had almost no power to do anything. It couldn't tax. It couldn't raise a standing army. It could barely convince states to send delegates to meetings. It was a government in name only, a polite suggestion, easily ignored. The states themselves were, to put it gently, not always cooperative. They printed their own money, enforced their own tariffs, and occasionally flirted with the idea of going their separate ways entirely. Border disputes flared. Trade wars broke out. It was, in many ways, less a country and more a very tense neighborhood potluck, where everyone brings their own dish and refuses to share. Economic conditions were, quite frankly, bad. The war had left the young nation in debt, massive, sprawling, unpaid debt. Currency had been wildly devalued. Farmers who had gone off to fight returned to find their land mortgaged or seized. Soldiers who had been paid in IOUs waited for compensation that never came. There were bread riots. Protests. And in 1786, in western Massachusetts, there was Shays' Rebellion, a full-on armed uprising led by disgruntled veterans and farmers, furious over taxes and foreclosures. The new government, powerless under the Articles, couldn't do much to stop it. Wealthy elites, alarmed by the spectacle of democratic unrest, began murmuring that perhaps they had given too much power to the people. Perhaps, they thought, liberty needed some guardrails. And so, out of this post-revolutionary stew of disorder and debt, the Constitutional Convention was born. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to do something they weren't technically authorized to do, scrap the Articles and write an entirely new constitution. What emerged was a bold document, visionary, contradictory, ambiguous, and deeply imperfect. It created a stronger federal government, with the power to tax, to raise armies, to regulate trade. It also built in checks and balances, fearing too much concentrated power. And, not insignificantly, it compromised on slavery, enshrining the institution it had so pointedly ignored during the Revolution. Freedom, once again, was defined narrowly. The Constitution did not include voting rights for women, or Native Americans, or the enslaved. It offered no Bill of Rights, not yet, and no real clarity on what "we the people" truly meant. But it was a beginning. A structure. A scaffolding for a new experiment that, if nothing else, aimed to be different. Outside the political sphere, ordinary people tried to pick up the pieces. Merchants reopened shops. Farmers replanted fields. Families tried to locate relatives who had gone missing in the fog of war. The rhythm of daily life returned, slowly, unevenly, never quite as it had been before. Some things were different. The very idea of being American began to take hold. Not all at once, and not for everyone, but gradually. It was an identity stitched from scratch, part defiance, part optimism, part myth. Local loyalties still dominated, people thought of themselves as Virginians, New Yorkers, Carolinians, but the seeds of something broader had been planted. Schools opened. Newspapers expanded. Debates flourished. People talked about rights, about representation, about governance. It wasn't always civil. In fact, it rarely was. But there was an energy, a kind of civic fidgeting, as if the country had just stood up for the first time and wasn't quite sure how to walk. And yet, for many, little had changed. Enslaved people remained enslaved. Women remained disenfranchised. Native lands continued to be seized. The poor remained poor. The new government may have had a new name, but for much of the population, it still looked an awful lot like the old one, just without the British accents. Even among the revolution's most enthusiastic supporters, there was unease. John Adams fretted about the mob. Jefferson worried about centralization. Hamilton worried about everything, especially money. Washington, though revered, often found himself presiding over a nation that seemed to be permanently on the edge of bickering itself to pieces. And abroad, the world watched. Some with admiration. Some with skepticism. Monarchs scoffed. Philosophers cheered. And across the Atlantic, in France, people began to wonder whether liberty could, perhaps, be imported. But within the young republic, there was no time to bask in theoretical glory. There were roads to build. Debts to pay. Laws to write. Disputes to settle. The war had ended. The revolution had succeeded. And yet, everything was still uncertain. So many revolutions end in disappointment, not because the dream was wrong, but because reality is more complicated than rhetoric. Because slogans are easy, and governance is hard. Because freedom, once won, must be organized, negotiated, revised, and reimagined. The American Revolution did not bring utopia. It brought a beginning. And in that beginning, there was chaos. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we believe that history is not just made of fireworks and turning points. It's made of what happens next, when the confetti settles, the ink dries, and the people who once fought for freedom sit down at long, creaky wooden tables and start asking awkward questions about taxes, and representation, and who's going to fix the roads. So let's rest now in that quiet moment, after the shouting, after the smoke, after the declarations. Let's lie beside the farmer returning to a field grown wild. Let's sit with the printer, uncertain whether anyone will buy his newspaper. Let's walk beside the soldier whose back still aches, wondering if his pension will ever arrive. Let's drift slowly through that strange, soft moment when a war ends, but nothing feels settled. Because this is what happens when you win a revolution. You have to figure out what you've won. And how to live with it. History is not what happened. It is what we remember happened. Or what we choose to remember. Or, more often than we care to admit, what we have been told to remember, neatly packaged, proudly recited, uncritically accepted. The American Revolution has, over the centuries, been polished. Not just preserved, but buffed to a shine. Its contradictions, its compromises, its slower and sadder parts have been set aside in favor of something simpler. Something easier to teach. Easier to admire. Easier to cheer for. This is not unusual. Most nations do it. They build myths because myths are sturdy. They endure better than messy facts. They comfort better than ambiguity. And they're excellent for parades. But tonight, as we lie back and let the past flow softly over us, we'll take a slower path. One that meanders. That notices the gaps in the narrative. That pauses, patiently, at the edges where memory becomes myth. Because the American Revolution, as we often hear it, is not the whole story. It is a version. A selection. A remembering shaped by what we wanted to become, more than by what we were. We remember the Founding Fathers as noble thinkers, eloquent, brave, enlightened. Which they often were. But we forget that they also disagreed constantly, harbored deep flaws, and were often improvising. The Constitution, so often revered as a sacred text, was born from compromise and dispute. The Declaration of Independence, while a masterpiece of political literature, was also a rhetorical tool designed to rally support and justify rebellion. It was not neutral. It was persuasive. And in persuasion, one must leave things out. We remember Paul Revere, galloping into the night, warning of the British. We forget that his ride was part of a larger network, that others rode too, that he was captured, that the moment was less cinematic than we make it. We remember the Boston Tea Party, bold and rebellious. We don't always remember that it was also the act of disguised men vandalizing private property in protest of a tax that, ironically, made tea cheaper. We remember the revolution as a unified movement. But we've already seen how fragmented it was, how many hesitated, refused, or quietly endured. We remember the flags and the speeches, but less so the hunger, the frostbite, the missed paychecks. We do not often remember the enslaved who fled to the British, or the native nations who were not consulted, or the women who waited at the hearth while others took credit. These are uncomfortable memories. They clutter the narrative. They introduce too much reality into a story that's supposed to be inspirational. But history is not tidy. And when we tidy it, we lose something essential. The legacy of the American Revolution is not just in the founding documents or the birth of a new government. It's in the way we remember it. And the way we remember it says more about us now than it does about them then. For example, the phrase, "all men are created equal," has been repeated so often that it's acquired a kind of holy glow. But what did it mean in 1776? It did not include women. It did not include the enslaved. It did not include the poor, the landless, or indigenous people. And yet, over time, it has come to be interpreted more broadly, more generously, aspirationally. That's the thing about national myths. They aren't just lies. They are truths in progress. They reflect not just what was, but what we hope might one day be. And so, the revolution became more than a war. It became a symbol. A symbol of defiance. A symbol of possibility. A symbol of starting over. But symbols, while powerful, are also limiting. They can eclipse nuance. They can drown out quieter voices. They can create the illusion that everything important has already been said, and by the right people. After the revolution, generations of Americans were raised on a diet of simplified heroism. School books told stories of brave patriots and evil redcoats, of destiny fulfilled and freedom earned. The messiness, the hesitations, betrayals, contradictions, were sanded down. The complexity was not erased, but simply left out. And when it was taught, it was often taught through symbols, the Liberty Bell, cracked but proud. The American flag, with its neat rows of stars and stripes. The silhouette of Washington crossing the Delaware. These are potent images. But they are curated. They do not show the foot soldiers who deserted. Or the Loyalists who fled. Or the women scrubbing floors in war hospitals. Or the enslaved man who overheard strategy meetings while serving wine. We don't like to remember that revolutions are made up of ordinary people, tired, flawed, sometimes frightened. People who didn't always believe in the cause. People who disagreed with each other. People who were just trying to get through another winter. In remembering only the bold strokes, we lose the brushwork. Still, the myth endured. And it had uses. It was used to rally people in later wars. To inspire civil rights movements. To frame debates. To justify policies. The story of the revolution became a shorthand for American identity, a foundational tale to which all other stories must refer. But the more it was repeated, the more it hardened. It became harder to question. To complicate. To critique. And yet, people did. Activists pointed out the revolution's unfinished promises. Writers exposed its blind spots. Historians peeled back the layers and asked, what else was going on? Each generation, in its own way, revisits the myth, sometimes to reaffirm it, sometimes to revise it. That, too, is part of the legacy. Because perhaps the most enduring aspect of the American Revolution is not what it did, but what it continues to provoke: argument, inquiry, hope, disappointment. It is a living history, still being debated, still being rewritten. And when we remember it, we make choices. Choices about what to include. What to emphasize. What to quietly forget. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we are interested in those choices. We're interested in the silences. In what got left on the cutting room floor. In the pauses between the battles. The letters that went unread. The people who stood to the side of the painting, holding a lantern, or a tray, or a child. Because memory is political. And myth is not just what we believe about the past. It's what we need from it. And what do we need? Sometimes, comfort. Sometimes, pride. Sometimes, a guiding principle. And sometimes, just a good bedtime story. But tonight, as the last flicker of that old revolution dims to embers, let us remember that even myths are made by people, flawed, frightened, hopeful people. And behind every myth is a truth that wasn't convenient enough to keep. So rest easy now, wrapped in the quiet realization that history is not just something that happened. It is something we carry. Something we tell. Something we choose to whisper, again and again, until we either believe it, or dare to ask what's missing. And in the stillness between those whispers, you might just hear the past as it really was. Not glorious. Not perfect. But human. And so the story wins to its close. Not with a bang, not with a final cheer, and certainly not with everyone standing on the same side of the field, nodding in satisfied agreement. Because the truth is, revolutions rarely end that way. They do not wrap themselves in neat conclusions. They leave things behind. They leave people behind. We have been told, many times, that the American Revolution was a fight for freedom. And in many ways, it was. It broke from empire. It challenged monarchy. It declared, in bold letters, that government should come from the governed. But it was not a revolution for everyone. It was a revolution for a specific idea of freedom, conceived and defended by men who often defined liberty within the boundaries of their own reflection. Landowners, lawyers, merchants, generals, many of them deeply committed to justice, yes, but to a justice that moved through familiar rooms, dressed in familiar voices. It was not a revolution for women. Not in law, not in voice, not in vote. They carried the burden of the war, held households together, stood quietly in the shadows of fire and famine. They were the threads in the quilt of survival, and yet the documents bore none of their names. It was not a revolution for the enslaved. They listened to the talk of freedom while chained to the same walls. They were born under a flag that claimed all men were created equal, and they died without ever being recognized as men. It was not a revolution for native peoples. Their sovereignty ignored, their lands carved up by treaties they never signed. They were cast not as nations but as nuisances, and when the war was done, the borders of this new country moved ever westward, over their bones. It was not even a revolution for every colonist. Many remained loyal to Britain out of caution or principle or simple pragmatism. And when the war ended, they were punished, exiled, or simply forgotten, scrubbed from the story like stains on a clean tablecloth. And yet, it was a revolution. It changed the structure of power. It created a republic. It gave rise to ideas that would outgrow their founders. It opened a door, even if only a crack. And through that crack, over generations, others pushed. Women demanded their rights. The enslaved demanded their humanity. The poor demanded recognition. The forgotten demanded remembrance. And the memory of that first revolution became the soil from which later revolutions would bloom. This is how history moves. Not as a single leap, but as a slow, uneven walk. It forgets. Then it remembers. It excludes. Then it apologizes. It builds monuments, then quietly debates whether those monuments should still stand. So what do we do with a revolution that didn't include everyone? We tell it honestly. We say, this happened. And also, this didn't. We honor the ideas that shone, while refusing to ignore the shadows they cast. We say that the American Revolution was bold. But not complete. That it gave birth to a nation. But not yet a justice. That it lit a fire. But left too many standing in the cold. And we let that discomfort rest in us, not to shame the past, but to hold it gently. To understand it. To carry it forward, carefully. Because there is something tender, even beautiful, about a nation built on ideas it has not yet fully earned. It means there is still work to do. It means we are still becoming. At Whisper Sleep Histories, we believe that telling these stories softly does not make them weaker. It makes them fuller. It makes room for the quiet truths. The ones that do not shout. The ones that whisper from the margins. The ones that come not from declarations, but from diaries. From kitchen tables. From graves with no markers. So let this be the story you remember, softly. That the American Revolution was not unanimous. That it was not pure. That it was not finished. But it was real. And complicated. And human. Let it be the story of a country that declared something impossible, and then spent centuries trying, failing, and trying again to make it true. Let it be the story of a farmer who wasn't sure which side to join. Of a woman writing letters no one answered. Of a child watching soldiers pass, not knowing what words like liberty really meant. Let it be the story of possibility, held in imperfect hands. And as we close our eyes tonight, let us remember not the slogans, but the silences. Not the fireworks, but the waiting. Not just the revolution, but those for whom the revolution never arrived. Because they are part of the story too. And if we listen long enough, if we lie here still enough, we might just hear them breathing beside us, in the margins, in the footnotes, in the quiet pages we once skipped. A revolution, yes. But not for everyone. Not yet. But perhaps someday.